Well, welcome everyone. Today is Sabbath, January 27th, 2024, and I want to welcome you all to this Bible study today. And what we're going to do today is we're going to take a closer look at a particular passage, and not the entire passage, but just the gist of a particular series of verses within that passage. And specifically, we're going to take a look at John chapter 1. There's some very interesting information in John chapter 1, this gospel being quite different in nature and character from what are known as the synoptic gospels. And we've been, as you know, engaged in a very intense and in-depth study of the book of Mark of late, which was probably the first one that was written by all accounts. And we've learned a lot, and we're getting close to the final chapters there. But today I want to take a slight deviation and take a look at John chapter 1, because the book of John, which is known as the fourth gospel, it's not one of the ones that see together. Therefore, the synoptics means see together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's quite a different gospel account, and there are certain reasons for that, and we won't go into all that today. Maybe at some point we'll do the entire book of John, Yahweh willing. But for today, what I'd like to do, just to ease us back to the Bible studies after a 2-week break, is just to take a look at some interesting information and gain some insights from the first chapter. And we're going to go into a little bit of grammar today, Greek grammar, and we're going to take a look at some things there that are very interesting. So I'm going to try to keep things very simple in the way that I'm explaining it, and I don't think it's going to be overwhelming at all. Just kind of flow with it, and hopefully you'll understand the gist of everything that I'm mentioning. But you have to do that. You have this language is very important for this first chapter, because there's some things that are going on in the text, which unless you look at the grammar, unless you look at what's happening in the text itself, in the construction of the verses, it's very difficult to see that, because in English it just doesn't come through, not even close. In other languages it doesn't come through, but in the Greek in which it was written, it does in fact come through. And I want to take a closer look at that today, particularly the first few verses, and we'll do that and just see what we can do in about an hour, a little over an hour, and then we'll close, and then we'll continue, Yahweh willing, in Mark next week. So with that in mind, I want to take you to the text. And I want to read, I think we're going to confine ourselves to the first 18 verses, and we're probably not going to go through all of that, but I want to at least read the whole section so that we can get the overall picture. Whenever you're reading the scriptures, I recommend that you study the scriptures, not necessarily verse by verse, but entire sections of scripture, because that's where you're really going to get the best sense of what's going on in that passage. So it's always helpful to read entire sections of scripture, because everything is written in a specific context. And if you start isolating particular verses, that's where it winds up getting a little bit tricky. And a lot of times a message can come out that it's very far removed from what it's supposed to be saying, because you're taking a verse or two in isolation from the rest of the text. So I'm going to read you the first 18 verses, and then we'll come back and we'll look at a few things. We'll take a little closer look at the fish, so to speak. Okay. So John chapter 1, verse 1. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim. He was in the beginning with Elohim. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There came a man sent from Elohim, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of Elohim, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of Elohim. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Messiah Yahshua. No one has seen Elohim at any time. The only begotten Elohim, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." Okay, so we'll just stop there. So let's go back to the beginning here. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to have this in parallel with the Greek text so that we could take a look at a few things here and get a better sense of what's happening here. And I realize that that we don't all read Greek, but I'll point some things out and we can learn from it. When you look at John chapter 1, unlike the other stories, the other accounts in the Gospels, this takes a different approach, and this kind of takes it right in the middle of everything, of all the action. So, you don't have the origin story that you see in Matthew or in Luke. You don't have the beginning of his ministry, even where that you see in Mark, because Mark sort of jumps into the action too, right? It doesn't give you, Mark also does not give you an origin story, but it goes right into the action. But it starts as soon as he is baptized and he goes into his ministry. This with John is kind of strange. What are we doing here? In the beginning was the Word was with Elohim. It's like total removal from everything that we've seen in the synoptics. And there's this emphasis on Yahshua. We're not even told it's Yahshua, but we know it is because of the context. And we're not even told, or rather, we're told that he's referred to as light. There's a lot of metaphor in here, right? We're talking about things like the beginning and the Word, right? What is the Word? What's that all about? And we're looking at light, and we're looking at the Word become flesh, right? So it's very almost secretive in the way that it's presented, but it's actually quite plain when you realize what is actually happening here, and that we are being directed to, in effect, Jewish underpinnings of this text, right? Because we're being, in effect, referred back to the Word. When I say the Word, I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, right? Because this is also the Word, but I'm in this context, I mean it as the Tanakh, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, particularly the Torah, which talks about the beginning, and particularly in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see that in a couple of minutes. And there's also this concept of light. So if you think about what happened in the beginning of creation, the beginning of creation, the very first thing that Yahweh did was he lit the place up, right? Because there was just darkness everywhere. So we'll consider that in a couple of minutes as well. But I want to start out with looking at this concept of being in the beginning. Okay, let's take a look at the word here. So in the beginning was the Word. So what's happening here? So if you look towards the right, and hopefully everybody could see that, could see the parallel text here, the Greek text, as compared to the English on the left-hand side. Can everyone see that? Okay, great. All right, so just follow along with me here. So when you look to the right in the Greek text, in the beginning was the Word, right? So en arche ein halagas. So this word means in, and then this word arche, this word means it means the beginning, right? And I say the beginning, there's no definite article here. So when I talk about an article, I'm talking about the word right? A particular. So an article is referring to a particular a thing, a noun or some sort. But the definite article, if you remember your grammar, is the. It's a specific thing, right? So when you look at something here, like this here, you're not seeing a definite article here, right? And the reason for that is because of the choice of language, because when you look at beginning, when there's a word that means beginning, well, there can only be one beginning, right? So in this context, so there's no reason to have the definite article here because it's assumed that the beginning is the beginning. It's there's not going to be more than one beginning. So in the beginning, and the thing that I want to point out here is that this in the beginning, what is it doing? Well, we saw the in the beginning before also, right? So I want to just shift over for a minute because we've been heavily engaged in the study of Mark, right? So I want to go over to Mark 1. So in Mark, the beginning of the gospel, right? The beginning of the gospel. Here, the word is, again, arche, right? There's no N here because it's not in the beginning of the gospel. It's the beginning of the gospel, etc. Right? Which beginning? The beginning, right? Arche, but it's the same word. So what's happening here is you are considering a beginning, the beginning, and the idea here is to anyone that's listening to these words or reading these words is going to immediately, it's evocative, right? What is it evocative of? Well, it's evocative of the beginning. What beginning are we referring to? Well, the beginning that's the beginning of creation, right? So there's a creation that's going on here, and we're meant to see this text as the one in Mark. We're meant to see it as something that is in fact parallel with the beginning with which we're familiar in the book of Genesis. Let me take this out. So when you look at Genesis here in the beginning, and you look at John in the beginning, that's what we're meant to see. We're meant to have a feeling, an emotion. It's meant to evoke that sense of in the beginning. And when you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible that was prepared in Alexandria, Egypt, for the Greek-speaking Jews, when you look at the text, and here's the text of the Septuagint here. So when you look here in my computer program, LXX, that's the Roman numeral 70, because it's referred to the Septuagint. It's shorthand for the Septuagint, because this tradition says that the Septuagint was prepared and developed by 70 elders who were put into some rooms apart from one another, and after they were done with their translation agreed with one another. That's the tradition, right? The Septuagint, and that's what the term septa, right? 70 Septuagint is referring to. So the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. So when you look at the Septuagint of Genesis 1:1, what does it say? Well, it's the same thing, right? So you can see that, en arche. Now just compare that with John 1. You see it there? En arche. Because it's the same idea that's being conveyed, en arche. So when you go back to John 1:1, you're meant to have this transportation in your mind, in your thinking, back to the book of Genesis. There's a beginning that's happening here that's comparable to what's happening in the book of Genesis, right? So when you go back to Genesis, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the spirit of Elohim was moving over the surface of the waters. Then Elohim said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Elohim saw that the light was good, and Elohim separated the light from the darkness. Elohim called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning one day. So there's a lot, much more than I could possibly go into today. There's a lot going on here just in these first 5 verses. But the bottom line is that there's a beginning, and in that beginning, Elohim creates, right? We won't talk today about whether this is talking about an absolute beginning, or if we're talking about a recreation, right? That's happening here from something that already existed. The earth was formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. The spirit of Elohim is moving over the surface of the waters. So as we're going through the first verses of John, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today, I want you to realize that that's not a coincidence that we're saying that John is writing in the beginning, right? And truthfully, we don't really know if there's an original Hebrew book of John, of which the Greek is actually a translation, right? there's some debate, and I tend to have always believed that most of the Greek writings of the New Testament are actually translations and not originals, and that's because of a lot of evidence of Hebraisms, words and phrases in the text, in the existing Greek text, that don't seem to make sense unless you assume an original Hebrew. And also the way the constructions are done, sometimes it seems to betray an original Hebrew. But I'm not as adamant about that belief anymore as I used to be, for a number of reasons that I won't go into today. But in any case, and we don't have to debate that today, but the bottom line is that whether it was written in original Hebrew or whether it was originally written in Greek by John, he meant for us to evoke the feeling of Genesis 1:1. Okay, so let's take a closer look. So he says, in the beginning was the word, en arche ein halagas. So this word logos, you know that word, you've heard logos before, right? And that means it says the word, the message, the speech. It's kind of equivalent. You always want to be thinking about equivalence to what you find in the Old Testament, because remember that the underpinning of everything in the New Testament is the Old Testament, is the Hebrew scriptures. So when you think about the logos, you think about the Devar Yahweh. I would transliterate that D-A-V-A-R, Devar, or D-E-V-A-R, Devar Yahweh, the word of Yahweh. So you see all the time in the scriptures, and the word of Yahweh did this, and the word of Yahweh, the word in the prophets, right? And the word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah, or the word of Yahweh, the word of Yahweh spoke to this other prophet, or whatever. And that is the idea of Yahweh's intent being manifested in the world. And that is typically a reference in some way, shape, or form to this being that was always with Yahweh and that fulfilled the word of Yahweh, whether it was in a pre-existent form, as we see here, or in his human manifestation, as we see in the Gospels, or in a after resurrection manifestation through the power of the Holy Spirit, which is his spirit, right? It's the spirit of the Father, and it's also the spirit of the Son, carrying out the word of Yahweh, carrying out the work of Yahweh. But the word of Yahweh is speaking about a specific personage who is Yahshua the Messiah, right? In this case, in his pre-existent form. And when I say pre-existent, what I mean is in a form that existed, that always existed, and that pre-existent, pre means before, pre-existent, what existence? Pre what? Well, his existence, we mean as a human being, right? In flesh and blood, as we see documented in the gospel. So pre-flesh and blood, pre-existent, the Logos is referring to that. I want you to notice something interesting about this. And again, I said I'm going to go a little bit into the grammar, and here's where the fun begins. So when you look at this, en arche, in the beginning, ein halagas was the word, in the beginning was the word. So this is very, very important to understand this, because when you look at grammatically what's happening here, there's something that doesn't really come out in the English that is extremely important to an understanding of the text. And many times when you have that kind of a situation, it's not as important perhaps than you would notice that it is here. So sometimes you can have different interpretations of the Greek text into English or another language, and the doctrinal significance is relatively unsubstantial. I don't know. It's not of consequence as much. But in here, it is. So when you say in the beginning was the word, what does that mean? Does that mean at this beginning of creation, the word was there? Or does it mean, as some people say, that the word was created, that the word is a created being, and then the word did other things once he was created? Well, there was a time when, in my evolution of thinking and understanding the scriptures, when I thought exactly that I thought that Yahshua was a created being, that he was created by Yahweh. But that's not what the word says. The word is indicating, and it makes it very clear here, that before anything was created in the world, not that Yahshua was created first, but it indicates actually that and let's call him the Word rather than Yahshua, because he would not be known as Yahshua until he came in the flesh. So the Word, the Logos, actually, the Logos was not created by Yahweh. The Logos already existed with Yahweh, and that's very important to know. It seems like an insignificant, play on words, but it is not, because there are some doctrines that are promulgated out there by some people that want to promote the idea that Yahshua was a created being, and he was not. He was always with Elohim, and that's what we're being told here. And Arche ein halagos, the Word already was. And what's being indicated here with this term ein is, and here's where I want to get a little bit more specific with the grammar, because it's important. This ein is a form, it's a grammatical form of the Greek word eimi. And the Greek word eimi means I am, right? So this is a past tense, and I'm putting that in air quotes because that's not exactly not exactly accurate. It is a past tense version of I am, meaning I was, or he, more accurately, he was. Because if you remember your grammar, you have first person I, second person you, third person he. This here is a third person past tense of a me. So this was he was. Okay. So in the beginning, he was, the Word was. Who was? The Word was. Halagos. This is the definite article, the Word. So in the beginning, the Word was. Okay. And this is significant because what it is saying to you is that by the time that the beginning was on hand, in other words, this beginning that you see described in the book of Genesis, this beginning, which is a creation that was done, or recreation as the case may be, it's not important to our discussion today. But at the time of that beginning, as that beginning was, the things happened, he already was, is what this verse is saying. In the beginning was the Word. And I want to show you a screen from one of my classes where you're going to see this written out, because I don't have a very good whiteboard. So I'm going to show you this screen. I'm going to stop sharing this text, and I'm going to show you what the way that my instructor would have written this. And I think that you'll find it interesting. This is the same text here, right? And Arche ein halagos. And notice he has here, this is the word eimi, which means I am. And if you notice that he has an arrow pointing to Exodus 3:14, and we're going to take a look at that in a minute. So this is an allusion, and again, none of this is coincidental. So when John says en arche and is pointing to us to the beginning, he wants to point us to Genesis. He's pointing us to Genesis, but he's also pointing us to Exodus. And I want you to understand that the book of Exodus is really it's a sequel, if you will, right? If you think of sequels, like movie sequels, the book of Exodus is a sequel to Genesis. So if you look at Exodus in the language, as you're doing the Torah portions, Exodus it picks up right where Genesis left off. And in point of fact, the content in Genesis, all the content in Genesis is meant to point us to the main event. All the content in Genesis is essentially background information, which is pointing us to the main event, the main theme of the scriptures, which is what? Which is the Exodus. So if you look at the scriptures and you want to sort of pinpoint the central event in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that's it right there. It's Exodus, right? And there are a number of reasons for that. And someone might want to debate that. They might look and say, well, Abraham leaving and going to Ur of the Chaldees and going to the Promised Land, maybe no. That's all, in my opinion, that's all background. That's all precursor to the main event, which is Abraham's descendants winding up as slaves in Egypt, and then Yahweh rescues them and delivers them from Egypt. All of that information, everything, Joseph, everything is bringing them to the main event, which is in the book of Exodus, right? And in the book of Exodus, that deliverance of Israel from Egypt is what sets the pace for everything that happens afterwards. And one of the proofs I have of that is that when you look at the New Testament, the central event in the New Testament is also the Exodus. Why do I say that? Because it's a new exodus. It's a broader exodus, an exodus that doesn't, a deliverance that doesn't just involve the Israelite people, right? The Israelite nation, but it involves the entire world. But it's an exodus nevertheless. And that exodus is the departure out of death and into life that's effected through the main event, which is what? Which is Yahshua's execution and raising from the dead, execution and resurrection. That's a new exodus, right? So when you look at this kind of thing that we're looking at today, it shouldn't surprise us that we're seeing language that's reflected both in Genesis and in Exodus, and that's exactly what's happening here. Because this person that's being, or this personage that's being described in John chapter 1 is going to be the one who has the power to do this ultimate deliverance, this ultimate exodus. So when you look at this here, enarche ein halagos, this word is the third person, right, version of a me, which is I am. So ein is was, he was, specifically he was, third person. So in the beginning, the Logos, he was. In other words, in the beginning, the Logos already was. So let me see if you see this clearly. Let me try to move this here. Okay, there we go. So if you look at this diagram here, this is a diagram that would visually represent that. So if this is the point at which we start our text here in John, in other words, enarche, then what this is saying is not saying, you know, enarche in the beginning and then everything happens here. And in the beginning, the Logos was. Here's halagas. In other words, he was already all the way back here. He didn't start here on this line. He started way back here because he was always there with Elohim. And that's important to understand, okay? So when you look at this here and you go back to the Genesis, you see Elohim creating in the beginning, enarche, epoiesen, he made ha theos, ha Elohim wanted to say ha Elohim, tan uranon, the heavens, kai tengain, and the earth. So he's indicating that Elohim made the earth, and I want to just point out here that that this made, is it created out of nothing? Is it something that was already there that was just reshaped and created? Well, it actually indicates more of the latter. Okay? But again, we don't need to go that deeply into it. But it's talking about this initial creation, and the one who was already there is the one that's initiating the creating. He's the one that's doing the creating. How do I know that? Because when we go back to John, he's telling you he was in the beginning. Let's go back here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and we'll come back to that. And the Word was Elohim. He was in the beginning with Elohim. All things came into being through him. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. Okay, so if you consider a passage like Colossians 1, right? This is what we learn in Colossians 1. So it says in verse 15 of Colossians 1, speaking of Yahshua, he says, he is the image of the invisible Elohim, the firstborn of all creation. And this is why sometimes people think that he was a created being, because this word protatakos, people want to indicate that that's a created being. That's not what it's indicating. It's just indicating, so it's firstborn of all creation, and it's not indicating that he was a created being that's a firstborn. There's spiritual metaphorical significance that's going on over here because of the importance of the firstborn. So it's a metaphorical idea. It's not meant as a literal idea of a firstborn of creation as if he were being created. That's not what's being conveyed here at all. But when you combine this with John chapter 1, in the beginning he was, right? It's attributing to Yahshua the same quality of eternality, of having been there forever as the Father. right? So it's if we would interpret this as being a literal thing here, then it would be in direct contradiction to what we're seeing in John chapter 1. Because he was already with Elohim. He is the image of the invisible Elohim, the firstborn of all creation. So we'll come back to Colossians 1, but let's take a look also at Proverbs 8, because although Proverbs 8 is poetry, right? It is in fact describing an actual event. Okay, so it's a poem, right? It's wisdom literature. It's wisdom poetry, but it's describing the actual event that took place. So it's personifying Lady Wisdom, right? Is what the scholars call Lady Wisdom. The Lady Wisdom is just a quality that belongs to the one who possesses the wisdom, who is the one that's doing the creating. So let's take a look what it says. It says, does not wisdom call, and understanding lift up her voice? Okay, and then it talks about different things about wisdom crying out to mankind. And then when you get down to verse 12, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence. Again, it's poetry, right? And I find knowledge and discretion, etc. And it's talking about how wisdom is better than anything, including riches and everything else you can possibly want. And then when it gets down to verse 22, it starts speaking about wisdom with regard to wisdom's role in creation. And this wisdom, remember, it's metaphorical, it's poetry. And the metaphorical idea of wisdom comes in a word, right? Wisdom comes in a message. Wisdom comes out of the mouth. So wisdom is comparable, in my opinion, in this context, it's parallel to the term logos, right? Because it is the word that emanates from Yahweh, the wisdom that comes forth out of Yahweh, by which he created. So how did he do his creation? He spoke, right? He created by the word. The word then is intention, Yahweh's intention, set into action, put out into the world. And you do the same thing as a creator, whether you realize it or not. You do the same thing because you're created, and I'm created in the image of Elohim. And this is one of the ways in which that's reflected in the world, that we are able to create the same way. The creation happens twice. I remember Stephen Covey used to say this all the time, that creation happens twice. First, it happens in the mind, and then it happens in reality. That's exactly it. That's why words are so important. That's why you have to measure the words that come out of your mouth and evaluate them before they come out, because they can be for good and they can be for destruction. This is what James says in chapter 3 with regard to the tongue, right? That you can do it for destruction, and it could be as dangerous as a wildfire that's destroying everything in its path, as well as it could be a benevolent force. Because the word that comes out of your mouth, let your yes be yes and your no be no, for that reason, right? The word that comes out of your mouth is intention that all of a sudden is now set in action in the world. So Yahweh in Genesis, he creates by his word. He says, let there be light, and there was light. And you also see that light motif reflected in John 1, right? It talks about John the Baptizer, and it talks about the light. Who is the light? The light is Yahshua, which is what? The Logos, which is what? The wisdom, the word, right? So Proverbs 8:22, Yahweh possessed me at the beginning of his way. Notice again the term beginning, right? Yahweh possessed me. The word is if you look at the bottom left there, the word is Reshit, which is exactly what we're talking about in Genesis 1. Bereshit. Be is a preposition in Reshit, in the beginning, Bereshit. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created, or Elohim made. So this word, Yahweh possessed me at the Reshit. Yahweh possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. Why before his works of old? Because I was going to be the one creating the works of old. In other words, this is wisdom speaking. The Logos is speaking, right? In poetic fashion. Notice, from everlasting, the word is olam. Olam is the word that means eternity, means forever. Listen, from olam, I was established. Okay? So the word, if you look down below, I was poured out, I was cast. From everlasting. Established doesn't mean I was created, right? He was with Elohim. There is no creation involved there. He was with Elohim. He is Elohim, which is what it's saying to you in John 1, right? Your word is intention that he is set out to reality in the world. Yes, Absolutely. Yeah, I love that too. So from everlasting, I was established, and the word nasak means to be to pour it out or cast out. Not cast out, as in cast out. I was poured out. I was, you think about, the Holy Spirit poured out, right? It's kind of like that. For everlasting, I was established from the beginning. The what? From the Rosh, and that's not the same word. The word Rosh is from the head. The word, the beginning, the very beginning, whatever that is, because Yahweh has no beginning, right? From the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth, when there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. In other words, before any of that existed, I existed already, which is exactly consistent with what we're seeing in John chapter 1. So Yahshua is Elohim, right? He's not the Father, right? So I'm not trying to imply a Trinitarian doctrine, okay? But I see those as distinct beings, and that's another discussion for another day. But he has the same quality as Elohim. I don't even know if we're going to get past the first 3 verses. He has the quality of Elohim because he is Elohim. Okay, let's continue. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While he had not yet made the earth and the fields, nor the first dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep. So he's describing how Yahweh did things. He had this design, and like an architect, and he put out his schematic, right? He put out his design, his blueprint. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when the springs of the deep became fixed, when he set for the sea its boundary, so that the water would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him. And that's the whole thing there. I was beside him. I was there as a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men, which is incredibly, to me, incredibly significant that he has his delight, Shashumim, in the sons of men. And he is the Son of Man, right? So there's a lot that's packed in here that's actually quite beautiful. And it goes on from there. So this is a great description of what occurred in the beginning before everything was created. He was already there with Elohim, which is consistent with what we see in John 1. But there's more, right? It's more. It's in arche, ein halagas, the word ein, the word emi. He was. What is this? This is again Exodus language. It's pointing you to, you saw my instructor's note of Exodus 3:14. So when you go to Exodus 3:14, what do you see? Exodus 14 is when Yahweh speaks to Moses, and Moses is asking, when they say, what is your name, right? What am I going to say to them? Elohim said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And the Hebrew, Asher, you've heard this before, Asher Edyeh Asher. When you go to the Greek, it's interesting, and this is the Septuagint over on the right-hand side here, and the term is ego and me, right here. Ego and me, haon. The word I, and then this is the pronoun I, right? Ego. Think about the word in English, ego. What does that mean? Someone has an ego, right? It's the I, right? The ego is it's and you think about Freud and the ego and the id and all that. The ego is the I, me, right? That's where it comes from the Greek, ego, or ego rather. And then the word and me is reinforcing that. It's the verb of existence, right? Ego and me, I am. And then haon, it would be sort of the idea. It's also grammatically tied to the term I am. So it's like, so that's why sometimes people translate this I am who I am, or I was who I was, or I will be who I will be. I don't think all those are accurate, but the idea is that there's this connotation of the one who exists, the one who has always existed. So this term ego and me, haon, this term haon is essentially saying, right, I'm the one that is, I'm the one that exists. Ego and me, haon. Where else do you see ego and me? Well, ego and me, haon, this is, go back to John. Okay, so the ego and me, haon, I'll get back to that in a second. But I want to point out here that everywhere you look here, right? Take a look. This ein, which is giving you a connotation of the word emi, right? Because it's not usual to be using this all the time, and it's used in reference to the one who is tied to Elohim, right? Who is Elohim. So you see it everywhere. Ein halagas, ein prostan, ein here, ein here. It's used to refer to him again and again and again. Ein over here, ein over. That's a different name, but it's all over because it's an imprint, because it has to do with the Elohim of creation, who is him, right? Who is he? So when you go over to Revelation, the book of Revelation, and we'll come back to John. Revelation 1:4, John to the seven assemblies that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come. So when you look at the text here, the one who is, you have heard me say in the past that when it talks about the one who is and who was and who is to come, that this is a direct reference to Exodus, to Exodus 3:14-15, right? This is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am what I am, or I was who I was, right? It's that concept of existence. And when you look at the presentation of that here in Revelation, it says what? It says Apa ha'on, right? The one who is, the one who exists. Kai ha'ein, the one who is, the one who was, the one who is, the one who will be, who is to come. Okay, so this concept of ha'on, ein, this is all tied together to that verb of existence, to the name of Yahweh, right? Which is what I want to point out here. And then the concept of ego and me, well, that's Yahshua through and through, especially in the book of John, right? And I don't know if you remember that I once did a study on the seven, I forget what I called it, the seven qualities of Yahshua or something like that. And one of them was this concept of ego and me, which we're gonna take a look at in a minute. But I just want to see one more thing here. See, you see it here in the Septuagint for Exodus 3:14 is this term ha'on, right? If you look on the left-hand side, all the way to the left, where I have the English translation, ha'on, you see that it's highlighting that term am, right? Ha'on. So ego eimi ha'on, I am what I am, or I am that I am. I am the one who exists, right? It's always pointing back to Yahweh, right? And you see in the book of Revelation, it appears, I think, 3 or 4 times, as I recall, that terminology. So if you go back to the book of John, and you look, for example, over in John 8, for example, and he's having this discussion with the teachers of the law. Verse 56 is John 8:56. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? Yahshua said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. If you look at the Greek, right? Before Abraham was born, ego eimi, I am, right? When you look over at when they got a hold of him to arrest him, this is over in towards the end of John, in chapter 18. So in John 18, verse 4, so Yahshua, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to him, whom do you seek? They answered him, Yahshua the Nazarene. He said to them, I am he, or just simply, I am. So when you look at that in the Greek here, in verse 6, it's right here, right? Ego eimi, I am. And that's not something that a common person would say, ego eimi. That is a direct reference to the name of Yahweh and to the concept in Exodus 3:14-15 of the name of Yahweh, and this concept of the one who has always existed and the one who is, who was, and who always will be. Okay, but there's more. So when you look at John chapter 1, go back to it. Continuing In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim. So, and the Word, Kai Halagas, Ein Prastan Elohim, that's the word theon, I'll just say Elohim, Ein Prastan. So this is saying, this word here usually means, in this context, it usually means to something. But when it appears after this verb of existence, it takes on a different quality, and it essentially means with Elohim. So this translation is accurate. He was in the beginning with Elohim, and that's exactly right. So he was with Elohim. But what it's indicating, this, what does it mean he's with Elohim? Well, the connotation here is a little bit more subtle than just with. It doesn't mean that he was just with, like next to him or something like that. What it means was that he was in intimate fellowship with Elohim. That's what the term is describing here. He was in intimate fellowship with Elohim. So what have we established so far? We've established so far, and this is all the first two verses, right? We haven't even gone beyond that. We've established that he who we know as Yahshua, the Son, the Word, the Logos, we know that we established that he is eternal. So we've established his eternality. And now we've discovered through this prostan language that he is with Elohim, that he was in beginning with Elohim, that he was with him. He was in intimate fellowship with Elohim. Means that his heart was as one with Elohim. That's two. So his eternality and his intimacy. Okay, I'm back. This is my parchment for today. Right? About my bounty. What's going on here? Okay, there you go. You can see it. Yeah. Okay. Whatever works at the moment, right? Okay. So it's his eternality, right? So we already see that he's eternal. He was with Elohim from the beginning, but he is also in intimate fellowship with the Father. And the whole idea behind all of this, I mean, everything we read in this chapter and that we see throughout the Gospels, is that Yahshua's intent is to be with us, right? Immanuel, right? Is Elohim with us, is to restore the fellowship that was lost in the Garden of Eden because of sin. So his intention is in the same way that he is intimately related to the Father, that he's in intimate fellowship with Elohim. He is sharing that intimate relationship with his Father, with us. But he has to die in order to make that happen, right? He has to die in order to make that happen because of sin, right? It has to do with the substitutionary sacrifice. It has to do with a number of other subtleties that we don't have time to go into today. But in order for him to do that, to help us to share the intimacy, he has to go through what he has to go through. So I could show you this. If you go to John 17, what is John 17? Does anyone remember what John 17 is referred to? Well, it shows you right there, right? It's usually referred to as the high priestly prayer, Yahshua being, of course, our high priest. And as he speaks, listen to what he says. I'll just read a couple of verses here and there. He says, "Now, Father, glorify me." He's praying this where? He's praying this in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So he's about to go through the execution, and he's in pain. He's mentally, feeling it, but he knows that there's a greater mission. This is only recorded here, by the way, in John 17. You don't see this in the other Gospels. You have a piece of sort of the idea of this when he says, Father, if it's possible, take this cup away from me, but not as I will, but rather as you will. That's all that we ever hear about. But this is the entire prayer, or the essence of the prayer that he gave in the garden. And so he's praying, and this is what he says. He says, "Father," verse 5, "glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was." Isn't that interesting? With the glory, with the glory that I had with you before the world was. And you see here that the language conveys that. So he says, "I've manifested your name to the men whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they have come to know that everything you have given me is from you, for the words which you gave me I have given them. And on he speaks. And then he says, while I was with them, verse 12, I was keeping them in your name, which you have given me, and I guarded them, and not one of them perished, but the son of perdition, so that the scripture would be fulfilled. But now I come to you, and these things I speak in the world, so that they may have my joy made full in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I do not ask you to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. And then he says down in verse 17, sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have also sent them into the world. For their sakes I sanctify myself, that they themselves also may be sanctified in truth. And then he says, verse 22, the glory which you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, just as we are one. In them and you and me, excuse me, I in them and you and me, that they may be perfected in unity, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you have loved me. So this prayer, I've made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you loved me may be in them and I in them. This is a prayer essentially to convey the same fellowship, the same intimacy through him and through his acts and through his actions. He wants to restore that fellowship that was lost in the Garden of Eden. And he's the only one that can make that happen through his death. So he's going to die. He's going to take upon himself the sins of the world. He has drawn all the evil and all the darkness of the world unto himself. And then now he goes back to the Father. So, but he can't go back to the Father until he accomplishes this thing. And he accomplishes it, and we essentially go along for the ride, right? And then there are many verses that explain that in greater detail. And that's something that we can cover another day. So let's go back to John 1. So this latter part of the verse, in the beginning was the Word, eternality, and the Word was with Elohim, intimate fellowship, and the Word was Elohim, right? So this is interesting, and this is very much misinterpreted. So when you look at the terminology here, it says Kai Theos Elohim, right? Kai Elohim ein halagas. So literally, there's no definite article here, like there was over here. Tan theon here is with a definite article. This doesn't have a definite article, but it's implied. But there's something else that's going on here. Kai Theos ein halagas. The way, and I won't go into all the details, but the way that this is constructed essentially indicates that this term in Greek, theos, Elohim, this term here is what people would translate as God, right? When we say Elohim, Kai Elohim, ein halagas, this is not saying that the logos is Elohim. What it's saying in the construction, the word was Elohim, it's saying, it's using Elohim here, theos, it's using that as a quality. It's representing or highlighting Elohim as a quality. It's not saying the word was an Elohim, or the word was Elohim, although he is Elohim. There's other passages that prove that, but it's not saying that he was the same personage as Elohim, right? It's saying that the way that the construction is written is saying that the Logos belongs to a category that's called Elohim. In other words, it's saying this. If you have a circle, for example, and that entire circle is Elohim, and then you have another little circle, a concentric circle within that circle, and that little circle within is Logos. It's saying that Logos is a subset of Elohim, okay? The Logos is a subset of Elohim. In other words, in simple terms, it's saying that everything that Elohim was, the Logos was also. Everything that Elohim is, the Logos is also, right? So it's talking about, the first thing was what? His eternality. The second thing was his intimacy with the Father. And the third thing is speaking about his essence. In other words, and you see this throughout the book of John. So it's entirely consistent. It's like everything is being encapsulated here in the very beginning, and then it's unpacked throughout the rest of the book, of the gospel. he constantly talks about how he doesn't say anything unless the Father gives it to him. And he talks about how if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? And these allusions and direct assertions throughout the book of John of his intimacy with Elohim, and to the point where whatever essence his Father is, he is also, because he's just like his Son. I don't know if you remember when I was explaining to you and it's kind of interesting, which is kind of an aside, but directly related to this, in my view, this concept of that you see in the binding of Isaac, right? So when you check out the binding of Isaac over in Genesis, you know what? I'm going to give a different tab here. Give me a minute. So let's go to Genesis 22. And Abraham goes with Isaac, and then of course he's about to offer him, and Yahweh says, "Don't do it." But when Yahweh calls him, he says to him, "Now take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." Right? And then when you look at the Greek, not the Greek, the Hebrew text in verse 2, he uses the term. Let's see here. Take your son, your only son. Verse 2. He uses this term here, right? This is the term Yechidecha. And if you look down below, you see only. Okay. But this term Yechidecha is, again, this is how the English, in my view, doesn't convey the full impact of this. So this term only, it implies, by using the term only, take now your son, your only son. Only is an adjective here, right? Your only son. But this word here is like a simple conveying an idea of uniqueness, in the sense that this is your one and only unique son, right? But think about it. We know that's not true, because who else is alive at this time? Ishmael, right? So we know that Isaac's not his only son, because he has Ishmael as well. So what's going on here? And some people may say, well, yeah, but this is his only son, who's the son of the promise. Yeah, no, that's not it. He's talking about something different. So we all know the word, I think we all know the word echad, right? Which is when you think of the Shema, and you say, Shema Yisrael, hear or listen, Israel, pay attention, Israel. Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh our Elohim, Yahweh Echad, Yahweh is one. Okay, so is it saying that Yahweh is one in the sense of he's only one Elohim? What we call monotheism as opposed to polytheism, many Elohim. Well, there is a connotation there of that, and we know that that's true. But that's not really what that passage is saying. It's really referring to the Elohim as an Elohim. He's of uniqueness, right? He is our Elohim. He is one. He is unique. He's the only one because he's unique, in other words, right? So that's the same idea that's being conveyed here. So it is only, but not in the sense of numerically, right? It's in the sense of quality, only, right? Like you see down here, Yahid, only. It comes from the same concept as Echad. It's Yehidaka is like saying, and this is not me making this up. The woman that I got this from, who wrote a book, a Hebrew language book, a Hebrew grammar, Bani Pedrati Kittel, I think her name was. I don't know how I remember that, but she mentioned Yehidaka is more like the one who is as your own soul, essentially, is what it's saying. So take your son, the one who is as your own soul. It's like something reflexive, as being something that is unique in and of itself, and you can never replace it. It's like you feel the way that you feel towards one of your children, like this. There's no one else like this one, right? This one is unique. This one is the only one of its kind, of her kind, of his kind. It's kind of like that. And we all know that Isaac is representative of who? Of Yahshua, right? That's Isaac. Isaac is a type, what we call typology, right? He's a type, he's a metaphor for Yahshua. Of course, he was a real person, but in the text, he's functioning as a metaphorical precursor to Yahshua the Messiah. And he is his only son, his one son, right? But not just one son in the sense of a numerical. It's more important than that. It's deeper than that. It's the one with whom you are one, his unique, intimate relationship. And that unique, intimate relationship that he has with the Son, he wants to have with all of us, right? And Yahshua comes as the example who is the true Son of Man. Remember, he is the unique Son of Man. And there's a word here. It says in verse 18, no one has seen Elohim at any time. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. That's an interesting translation. How do you explain someone, right? It's like Yahweh gives the sense of who he is, right? And when you look at the Greek here, this word here, monogenes, okay, monogenes, I think I'm pronouncing correctly, only, unique, only begotten. I believe that this is conveying a similar type of concept as that Yechidacha was, the only begotten Elohim who's in the bosom of the Father. Well, he's in the bosom of the Father because how are you in the bosom of someone? You're in the bosom of someone if you are intimately related, right? You don't go down the street and go, just kind of put your head on anyone's chest, right? That's a very intimate move. It's a very intimate action. So this only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, right? He's unique. This word breast, chest, womb is the word for as well. It's like you have a unique, intimate relationship, and he wants to have that same relationship with us. As a matter of fact, the book of John is interesting because what does John say of himself too, right? I just thought of this too. So let me see if I can find that. Just bear with me, okay? Remember that this is the chapter that talks about the humility of Yahshua, right? The one that we read during Passover unleavened bread season. So in verse 23, right, the disciples are all sitting, reclining, and it says there was one, this is John speaking, right? He wrote the book. There was reclining on Yahshua's bosom one of his disciples whom Yahshua loved, right? The word agapao, which is the word from which we get the word agape. There was reclining on Yahshua's bosom. And that word bosom, kalpas, is the same word that was used up in John 1:18. So so John represents here one of the disciples who is intimately acquainted with Yahshua. He's on Yahshua's bosom, right? Because he's deeply acquainted with him. So this is a big theme for John, this idea of intimacy. And we see that again a few chapters later in John 17, when he's offering the high priestly prayer, and he says, I love these people so much that I want you to have that intimate relationship with them, right? John 15, he talks about himself being the vine, but then he talks about friendship, right? And he talks about, this is my commandment, verse 12, that you love one another. Is that word agapao again? Just as I have loved you, right? He's leading by example, right? He has intimacy with the Father, and he wants to convey that same relationship with Yahweh. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. That's how intimate I am, that I'm willing to lay down my life for you. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I've heard from my Father, I've made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you. This is very intimate language, right? And appointed you so that you would go and bear fruit, and so that your fruit would remain, so that whatever you ask of my Father in my name, he would give to you. This I command you, that you love one another, because that intimacy is going to be conveyed how? It's going to be conveyed through love, right? It's going to be conveyed through love. Okay, so let's go back and just say a couple more things, and then I'll actually bring it to a close because we got about 10 minutes left. Yeah, and I just wanted to revisit very quickly Colossians 15, right? Because we talked about Proverbs 8 and wisdom speaking, right? So he says 1:15, he is the image of the invisible Elohim, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is very weighty language, right? He is also head of the body, the assembly, and he is the beginning, the arche, right? That's beginning again. The firstborn from the dead, pratatokos, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. So he is the preeminent one. He is the one, he is the high priest. He is the beginning ruler, right? He is the one that is through which everything was created and through whom it's all brought together. That's why the entire Bible points to him. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. What is he trying to accomplish? He's trying to reunite heaven and earth, right? The breach that occurred on earth that caused a break in intimacy and fellowship with Yahweh, he's restoring it. And the pattern that was given to Moses on the mount, which was the pattern that became the pattern for the tabernacle, which is the pattern that became the pattern for the temple, the physical temple, which is the pattern that became the pattern for the spiritual temple in our day, is to do what? Is to reunite heaven and earth, which is what the temple represents, right? It's not us dying and going to heaven. It's Yahweh sending his son to die, him rising up to Yahweh to back, and having fulfilled his responsibility through a substitutionary death and resurrection to indicate new creation, and then him coming to us. Right? It's not us going to him, it's him coming to us, Emmanuel, right? And just to sort of wrap it up, in John 1, we don't have time to go through all this, but you notice the concept of light, phos, and what do you see in Genesis 1? That the very first thing he does is he brings light so that he can do the creation, right? There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. There's the concept of light, there's the concept of man, and he is the Son of Man, right? He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Colossians, Proverbs 8. And the world did not know him. And then he talks about his rejection and how he was rejected, but still he would be received by those who believe in his name. And the word, verse 14, and this is the one I'll just kind of dwell on a little bit, linger on a little bit. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glorious of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And then when you compare that once again with the Greek, in verse 14, it uses this term over here, which is eskenosen. Eskenosen is from a word. Eskenosen means like to pitch, to dwell, or to pitch a tent is effectively what it's saying. So if you think about the concept of the Feast of Tabernacles and the concept of the tabernacle being pitched in the camp, it's the idea of pitching a tent and being in intimate fellowship with somebody, right? So who is pitching the tent in this case? Well, it's Yahshua himself pitching the tent because he is coming to dwell with us, right? It's Elohim trying to live with us for all eternity. The word became flesh, kai halagas, sarx. So remember before we saw that kai Elohim and halagas? Well, here you have a similar thing, kai halagas, sarx. The lagos was flesh. It doesn't mean that he was a hunk of meat, right? It means that he became flesh. This flesh is not referring to a physical flesh, obviously, right? It is and it isn't, right? Because it's really talking more about him coming as a carnal man. So it is talking about him coming as a human being. That's what it's talking about, right? It's not talking about him being a hunk of flesh. It's talking about him coming as a human being. In other words, taking on the same character as the men and women he came to save. And when you look at the Old Testament and you look at whenever Yahweh made an appearance, he could not just show up, right? Because it would be detrimental, to say the least. So you think about Moses, and you think about Moses, he asked Yahweh, let me see you. He says, I want to see you. Exodus 33:17. Yahweh said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. Notice the intimacy, right? And Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. Show me your glory. He wants to see his kavod. The word kavod means weight, heaviness, right? So the word kavod, it has to do with honor of Yahweh, his presence, his essence. I pray you, show me your glory. He wants to see his essence with him, but he couldn't face to face because of sin, right? And he said, Yahweh said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim the name of Yahweh before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious and will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. So what is this? He says, I'm going to show you my goodness, verse 20, but he said, you cannot see my face. For no one man can see me and live because he's too holy, right? Then Yahweh said, so he said, there's a place by me, stand on a rock. I'm going to go by, and while my glory is passing by, I'll put you in the cleft of the rock, cover you with my hand, protection until I've passed by. Then I'll take my hand away, and you'll see my back, but my face shall not be seen. So he'll get to see him, but we'll get to see the one that's following in the rear guard. Who is what? That's who's the presence of Elohim, who is Yahshua, is not directly the Father himself, but his representative, who is Yahshua. Because he says, a man can't see me and live. But notice, he says, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim the name of Yahweh before you. And notice what's associated with the name of Yahweh. Notice what's associated with his presence, with his kavod. I'll be gracious to whom I'll be gracious. So grace, and I will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. Compassion, mercy, love. Those are all qualities of Yahweh. Grace, mercy, compassion, love, right? This is why when Yahshua comes, these are the things that he evidences to everything that he does to people, right? Grace, mercy, compassion, love. This is why when you're dealing with legalistic religion, it's such a turnoff, and why at some point you have to reject it, right? Even if you take a self-righteous attitude for a time and you wind up, taking that kind of an attitude, that better than thou attitude, at some point, if you're a sincere person, that has to fall away and crumble by the wayside, because Yahshua's true essence is not that. It's not being right. It's not being better than everyone. It's not knowing every aspect of the law and keeping it perfectly. It's not keeping the Sabbath perfectly and everything else, right? I want to preach here. But it's about what? It's about demonstrating love, grace, compassion. And those are the things that characterize Yahshua's ministry, right? So he goes in chapter 34, Yahweh actually does this in verse 5. Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood there with him as he called upon the name of Yahweh. So there's a Yahweh who's calling upon the name of Yahweh, and there's a Yahweh who's doing this thing. It's two Yahwehs that are described here. Why is that? Well, because one of those is the one who is his presence, right? Then Yahweh passed by in front of him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim. Notice the qualities again: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, chesed, and truth. All the things that Yahshua exhibited when he came in human form, right? Compassion, grace, slow to anger, abounding in chesed, which is loving kindness, and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity. The angel of Yahweh is the one who would forgive iniquity. Remember in Deuteronomy 23, he says, obey the angel, because if you don't, he's not going to forgive you, right? Yahshua had the authority to forgive sin. Who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. That's why he's the temple, right? That's why he represents the temple. He's the cornerstone of the temple. Where do you go for forgiveness? You go to the temple. Only now you don't do it in a physical building. Now you do it in the body of Messiah. Think about that, the term body of Messiah, right? You go to the Messiah, to the body of Messiah, where forgiveness is found, because he is the chief cornerstone. He is the one who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, etc. Okay? So these are all things that really just kind of lend weight. And the reason I mention all this is because you couldn't see his glory and live, right? So you could only see his back. And the way that you could see, that you could speak with Yahweh was what? Moses, from that point forward, what did he do? He met him in a cloud, right? Because the cloud hid the presence of Yahweh. So Moses was seeing the cloud, or do you see the pillar of cloud, of fire or cloud? And why? Because the glory was within that cloud, right? But because he was in the cloud, he could live. He wouldn't die, because, or the children of Israel, if they would see that, they could live because it was enshrouded in the cloud. So when the word became flesh, when the word became sarx, flesh, and dwelt among us, we saw his glory. Glory is of the only begotten from the Father. How is it possible that we could see his glory? Full of what? The kinds of things that we saw in Exodus 33 and 34. Grace, truth, compassion, mercy, right? And the reason that we could see him, that we could see his glory, because it was enshrouded in what? In flesh, right? It's not a cloud this time, but it's in flesh, because he came as a man. And from this point forward, he will always be some version of a man, a glorified man, a man in a glorified body. But right? And so he dwelt among us. It was like he dwells among us in a body, and it's his whole assembly is now referred to as the body of Messiah, right? All those things are tied together. So it's Elohim dwelling with us as a temple, as a tabernacle. The word eskenosen means literally he tabernacled among us. He set up tent. He set up a tent. He pitched a tent. He is our tabernacle. He is the one to whom we go for refuge, right? And there's so much more that we can mention here, but I think I'll start wrapping it up there. But this is just amazing information, and I hope that you're as inspired by it as I am. And there's much more. So Yahweh willing, we can cover some more of this in the future. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of important points that I meant to mention. And the last thing I'll say is just a bit of a lament. And I just ultimately have to say I trust in Yahweh, right? Because these are things that I wish that people would know, right? I wish that people would that they would know these things, that they would know them, and that they would be inspired by them. I think that if people understood these things, it would blow their minds, and they would have such a different attitude about life and everything else. And and I feel sometimes that we're just there's just so few of us, relatively speaking, and maybe it's a thing, or undoubtedly it's something like and I'm not comparing myself to Elijah, but something like Elijah experienced, where he thought he was the only one left, and Yahweh said there are 7,000 knees that haven't bowed to Baal. And I have to believe it's a situation like that, or else I'd lose it. But I look at these things and I say, far from the insignificant, cheap way that people look at the Bible and look at the faith, and people who think that they know Christianity and they say all kinds of ridiculous things. I wish that people really understood this, because if they understood this, they would see Yahshua as so much greater than they view him, and they would stop looking at him as, even people who believe in him, that they would stop looking at him as their buddy, right? And that's good. I'd rather that people look at him as their best buddy than not look at him at all. But it just cheapens it, and it tarnishes what really is there. And I have to believe that Yahweh, in his way, in his time, is gonna have this message explode in such a way that it will be unmissable, if that's a word, right? That people won't be able to miss it. And I think when that happens, it will change lives.